Today's tutorial is on Rachmaninoff's fabulous Prelude in D major. Personally, I find that with Rachmaninoff's work it can often be difficult to work out how to practice it effectively because it's so involved. So I hope that you'll agree in this tutorial I'll give you some innovative ways that you can work on it to master it for yourself. If you're sitting comfortably, then let's begin. This fabulous piece is around 5 minutes long and it's classified by Henle as level 6. Whilst the notes themselves aren't tremendously difficult, as always with Rachmaninoff there is a lot of intricacy in the score, multiple voices and crossing or intertwining of the hands. In addition, he makes frequent use of polyrhythms and of additional highlight notes. Therefore there is a lot going on and it is really worth ensuring we fully work things out and properly study the score. This prelude splits nicely into 4 sections. The first, second and fourth sections sharing the same theme, with the third having a different motif. So let's have a look at the first section. I further split this section into 4 segments that we can initially work on individually. I found that it always pays to start off far smaller than you might think necessary, especially with a piece like this. Before we look at the first of these segments in detail, let's just take a look at the features we have here. As we can see, the accompaniment is mainly in the left hand in triplets. However, in good Rachmaninoff style, sometimes the first triplet is replaced by a rest and sometimes it isn't. The melody is in the right hand and we can see that Rachmaninoff sometimes uses 8th and 16th notes, so effectively a polyrhythm over the left hand 8th note triplets, but also sometimes brings a triplet rhythm into the melody too. We can see that the section goes from pianissimo to forte and back down to piano. We can also see that some melody notes are marked tenuto, whilst others not. Finally, we can see that the hands frequently need to intertwine and cross. All in all, there is an awful lot going on even in this relatively straightforward page of music if we think in terms of notes alone. In terms of memorization, I'm not saying we need to play this from memory. However, we'll likely struggle if we need to keep our eyes glued to the score at all times. Thus, I recommend taking careful note of tiny differences here and there that we can use to support our memory. Now let's explore them in detail. What is interesting to do at this point is to simply play through the melody of this entire section to get a feel for it. It is simplicity itself. However, as we move further into the piece, it's very easy for the melodic line to get lost in a sea of notes. And so teaching our ears what it sounds like is a good use of our time. Okay, so all of that said, let's look at the very first segment. Perhaps the first thing to note is the opening arpeggio pattern. It's a simple D major arpeggio, yet spread out so far across the keys that perhaps even Rachmaninoff himself would not have had hands big enough to play this entirely legato. Thus, I think we can safely assume that finger legato is not the aim of the game in the accompaniment of this piece. Now, some pianists split this between the hands and some don't. Personally, I prefer to split it. Whatever your choice, it's well worth spending some time just on these 2 measures so that we can play them comfortably without needing to search for the notes. If you're splitting it between the hands, notate this split in your score. Let's now move into the first phrase of the melody. Straight away we can see that the melody is clearly marked mezzo forte and also cantabile, so it needs to sing. Equally, we can see that the left hand not only has a big jump, but it also needs to pass over or under the right. The reason I emphasize the jump is that landing that jump nice and softly is essential if we want the melody to sing, otherwise the bump will disturb the line. We also need to decide whether the left hand will go over or under the right. For my hands, it's far more ergonomic to let the left hand play mostly under the right. However, I urge you to experiment a little for yourself to decide. Equally, pay attention to whether you need to keep one hand either purposefully high or the other purposefully low, or perhaps even both. I'd also recommend writing this into the score. One last thing of note in the left hand is that the bass note is not the same throughout the phrase, appearing an octave higher at the end than it does at the beginning. A final tip would be to play the G and the A both with the thumb, as this helps us keep the left hand's profile lower. Once we've made these decisions, we can try practicing just this phrase, or perhaps the introduction plus this first phrase. Remember, we're aiming to be 100% sure we can land that jump softly, that our melody is singing, and that our hands aren't getting in each other's way. Before we move on, the reason I stress this so much for what is, in the grand scheme of things, a fairly simple phrase, is because I found that I frequently tie myself in knots thinking, did I go over or under? What fingering did I use? Should this be the higher D bass or the lower one? By formally thinking through first and making clear decisions that we then note down, we can ensure we are always practicing in the same way. Now let's turn our attention to the next phrase. We can see that we have the same decisions to make in terms of left hand under or over. The left hand also has the same change in bass note as we had earlier. Finally, we have the first occurrence of a polyrhythm where the left hand has eighth note triplets, with the right hand playing a standard eighth note followed by two 16th notes. Rachmaninov has placed two new tone markings here as even more evidence that he wants this to be clearly audible. So we need to ensure we don't have those 16th notes playing completely in line with the last of the left hand eighth note triplets. Again, this level of detail makes it worth devoting plenty of time to this phrase alone. Once we're really comfortable that we have our singing melody, our polyrhythm, and a confident left hand all working together, let's try playing this and the preceding phrase together. Once this is comfortable, let's start practicing from the beginning of the piece. An extremely useful thing to do at the very early stages of learning this is to revisit all of our decisions the following day. Are we still convinced the introduction should be split or not split between the hands? Is it right to play the left hand under or the right here? Once we've tested all of these things out, we can again try playing just the introduction and first phrase, and then the entire segment. Now let's look at the next segment. As we look at the first phrase, we can see that the accompaniment wraps around the melody. However, here, as it is somewhat further, the only sensible solution for me was for the left hand this time to go over the right. Equally, I decided here that I would redistribute some of the accompaniment notes as my short and relatively fat fingers get in each other's way here. In fact, it's often fairly easy to simply redistribute and the notes can become so much easier to play. However, before doing this, I think we need to understand why Rachmaninov has written in the way he has. Often, a hand distribution will be purely ergonomic. However, I believe Rachmaninov often does so for a musical reason. In making things slightly awkward, there are micro hesitations as one hand gets out of the way so the other can play those same keys. Thus, I would always initially be inclined to go with the distribution he suggests as our default starting point. However, where this would give a poor result in our hands, then we can redistribute. One final tiny thing to notice is that where in the previous segment we had triplet eighth note rests, sometimes here Rachmaninov replaces them with a tied note. This distinction is very important as of course we will likely be changing pedal at this point and therefore we would lose that note. Another reason why in my hands it's easier to redistribute in these places. So once we've discovered all these tiny things, we can start practicing this phrase. In the words of Liszt, think 10 times, play once. When we look at the next phrase, we have yet another tiny challenge in that rather than the accompaniment being preceded by either an eighth note triplet rest or a tied eighth note triplet, we actually play an eighth note triplet. Equally, if we look at the way the phrase is constructed, here it has an extra note at the end. Thus, the G sharp finishes this phrase rather than starting the next. Unlike the previous phrase where the equivalent note, the F sharp, actually starts this phrase rather than terminating the previous one. We have, of course, all the same decisions to make: hand under, hand over, redistribute or not. Now we've done all of this, let's try to practice this phrase on its own as we did for the phrases in the first segment. Once the phrase itself feels good, Let's try to play both the first and second phrases together. This then takes us to our third segment. I think we can consider this to be the climax of this particular section, although of course not of the entire piece. The first notable thing is the rolled chords here. You'll hear some pianists roll these extremely slowly and powerfully, and others not. However, as they are the only chords that are marked as rolled here, it is clearly intended as a feature. We also have the fact that the right-hand melody now also uses triplets from a rhythmic perspective, however, in each case not using the same figuration as the left hand. Again, let's work on this phrase by phrase. I think our very first note of the phrase is the apex, being a very low bass note and a forte rolled chord. Again here, I opted to redistribute some of the left-hand notes. The second phrase, while still forte, is already starting to taper off, given the bass note is an octave higher, plus we have a diminuendo at the end. In the third phrase, we need to pay particular attention to the triplets, and again note the tenuto markings. There's an interesting situation in the third phrase where I feel I needed to have part of the accompaniment with the left hand going under the right and then immediately switch to playing over the right. The fourth phrase again has a triplet concept to be executed differently, and again note the tenuto. Note here also for the first time Rachmaninov keeps both bass notes in the same octave. Now we have our fourth segment. Within just two short phrases we go from piano to forte and back down again. The first phrase uses eighth notes over eighth note triplets in a very strong manner, using them to make the transition from piano to forte. We equally have an interesting chord that for smaller hands can be very difficult to play. I certainly would need to roll it if I used 1 and 2 on the C sharp and D. However, in Rami Barniv's book, The Art of Piano Fingering, he suggests that in fact when we have a black key to be played at the same time as an adjacent white key, there is an option to take both notes with the thumb. I suspect this would be quite hard to pull off at speed, however at this tempo I found that it is a much more elegant and reliable solution than rolling the chord. If you do need to do this, spend lots of time working on just this phrase, gradually building the dynamic until it feels second nature to play this chord. The second phrase leads us beautifully into the next section. Its main feature is a long altered scale in the left hand, parts of which I chose to redistribute. We can then start putting the segments together gradually, first with maybe just the first and the second, then the second and third, then the third and fourth, before working on 3 at a time. The key is to gradually get ourselves used to playing in longer lines, and equally given all of the tiny details in the score, we should keep referring back to it before touching the keyboard to remind ourselves. A power tip is to start recording ourselves once we can play just this first section. Sometimes our ears will hear what they want to hear. For example, I believed I was putting plenty of distinction between the melody and the accompaniment. However, I noticed in my recording of it, whilst it was there, it was nothing like the same degree I heard when playing. As we move forward, I'm not going to go into the same level of details as I did here, otherwise this video will be hours and hours long. I thought it was well worth doing it for the first section just to help highlight the type of things to look for in the remainder of the piece. So as you work on each phrase going forward, spend some time really studying what's in it above and beyond the notes themselves. So let's look at our second section. Let's use the same divide and conquer approach with this section by first splitting it into 4 segments along the same lines as we did for the first. Rachmaninov now introduces the 3/2 polyrhythm in earnest. The left hand is mostly 8th notes, with the right hand mostly playing an accompaniment in 8th note triplets, in addition to the melody. As this section uses very similar underlying melodic materials as we did with the first section, let's first play through the melody so that it's nice and clear in our minds. Also note that here every single melody note is marked with tenuto, so this is clearly the main melodic material, and the 8th note triplets I think form a sort of counter melody that needs to remain much quieter. I personally found this as a very difficult section as there is an awful lot going on. Therefore, here I'm going to recommend a multi-stage approach. Initially, we're going to work segment by segment rather than phrase by phrase. However, we are going to significantly simplify things to start with. So our first practice approach is going to be to take the melody and the eighth note triplets, but rather than playing everything in the right hand as written, we'll play the melody with our left hand and the eighth note triplets with our right. This is an interesting exercise as we can still think about dynamics and phrasing of the melody, but they'll be much easier to achieve as we're not trying to balance everything in one hand. However, our major concentration here will be on getting the eighth note triplets super quiet. Use this as an opportunity to work out a nice right hand fingering. As we can see, the entire segment meanders around a D major scale. In our next stage, we'll dedicate ourselves to the left hand by playing the left hand as written, but only the melody part of the right hand. Those left hand arpeggios are very spread and so might not fit easily under the fingers, especially if you have smaller hands. I opt to use hand shifts rather than trying to stretch between the notes. Keep working using both of these variants until you find that each hand is super confident with what it needs to do. If a 3/2 polyrhythm is something you find a challenge, then a helpful step here is to practice the polyrhythm in situ, but using add-on in the left hand. For now, we'll ignore the melody and stick with a simplified right hand. Here we start with just the first 2 notes of the left hand in each phrase, but all of the right hand counter melody notes. Then we add the 3rd and 4th notes, and then the 5th and 6th notes. Then, all of our groundwork complete, we can start working phrase by phrase again as we did for the first section, putting all of the notes together. I think the 3 previous stages were super valuable because I personally found that there was just too much to think about, even in shorter phrases, to try and play as written from the get-go. Know also that frequently it will be impossible to hold on to the melody notes as the right hand accompaniment is too far above them. Thus, we must use the pedal accordingly and get used to joining the melody in the pedal rather than the fingers. This means we need to be very precise with the pedal. Another memorization aid here is that in this segment, the left hand plays on the first 8th note of each measure, unlike often in the first section when there was a rest. We can use the same multi-step approach for the second segment. Again, keep working until these things feel easy to you and you have no hesitation in finding the notes. After that, we can put everything together. For the third segment, it's just rinse and repeat. However, we do have the added complication of the hands needing to intertwine. So again, spend some time phrase by phrase if necessary to decide whether under or over. Our fourth segment is a little bit more of a brain twister in that the 8th note triplet pattern now passes from hand to hand. So when we practice just 8th note triplets and the melody, we'll need to take that into account, and where the triplets are in the left hand, we'll need to use the right hand for the melody. I would personally be inclined to work on each segment in turn until we can play them all with our simplified versions, prior to adding back the notes we omitted. If you wish, you can even start adding segments together and practicing them in pairs or even as a whole section while still using a simplified version. This really depends on how difficult you find this particular section. It's hard to resist the temptation to move forward, but if this is at the more difficult end of the pieces you would try to learn, discretion, as they say, is the better part of valour. Our third section now moves the triplets back into the left hand and introduces a different melody in the right. It also inverts the polyrhythm to 2/3 rather than 3/2. We also have the introduction of a few little accent notes to be played outside the melody and marked tenuto. So before we even start trying to practice this, let's play through the melody and use octaves where these are present in the score. I split this into a couple of segments to help us focus our practice, and then within each segment we can focus initially on individual phrases. Now for the first phrase, I think the most effective way to learn this is to simply start somewhat under tempo and use the add-on technique. Working from the beginning, hands together, we start with the first set of eighth note triplets, then we have the second, then the third, and so forth to the end of the phrase. If we work on the fingering carefully, we can see that we basically start with an arpeggio in the left hand and follow it with an altered D major scale. My approach to learning the remaining phrases was in fact to simplify the left hand initially. Given the hand needs to move around quite a lot, then removing some of these position changes can be a useful starting point. It also gives us precious microseconds to glance at the score if we need to initially. So we can do this by removing the final set of eighth note triplets in each measure in every phrase except the last. Starting with the second phrase, what we can see is that we have a bass note, then we shift hand position and we have the same arpeggiated pattern twice. So if we simply omit the notes in between, the left hand becomes eminently easier to play as we only need to move our hand once. We can equally notice that the first time we play the arpeggio, we go straight up and down. The second time we have a tied note at the top. This same pattern happens in the next phrase and the following one. Another thing we can do to keep things simpler is to omit the right hand highlight notes in the second, fourth and sixth phrases. Whilst the pattern changes slightly in the fifth phrase, we can stick with the same approach, that of omitting the last three eighth note triplets in each measure. Our next segment has the right hand playing every eighth note in each measure with no breaks or rests. It also adds octaves and finally big chords at the climax. One thing I'd say here is watch the phrasing carefully. I found on listening back to my practice recordings, I had a tendency to phrase it from the low note upwards rather than from the highest note as Rachmaninov has done. Indeed, if you listen to many pianists play this, they almost have the entire segment as one long phrase. For the first three measures of this segment, let's use the same approach as we did in the previous one, that of omitting the last eighth note triplets in the left hand. I would work on this measure by measure, always ending on the downbeat of the next measure. Something that helped me was to realise that it calls for us to play right hand octaves right in front of the torso. This isn't the most comfortable or controlled of positions, and so you might find it helps to lean slightly towards the left as you do this. Be conscious about this until it becomes second nature. Once you're confident with each measure individually, add them together progressively, still omitting those same left-hand notes. The final phrase leads us up to the climax and back down again. I would use add-on accompanied by a floating fermata here. So working in sets of eighth note triplets, let's learn each measure separately. So we play the first set, place an imaginary fermata on the end of the final eighth note triplet. Then, when we add the next set, we use that fermata to give us time to think. We can then do the same again as we add the fermata to the last note of the second set. Keep this fermata in place for as long as necessary. Whether you're reading or playing from memory, we need to remove any hesitation as what notes come next, and the fermata makes it easier to do that. Then we can join the entire segment together, but keeping these simplifications in place. Try also getting used to playing both of these segments in these simplified manners. Perhaps at the end of each practice session, once you've got to the point that you have worked on each segment individually, play them both together. Once this starts to feel much easier for us, we can go back to the beginning of each segment and progressively start adding back the missing notes. When I did it, I worked on the second phrase only at first to add back the left-hand notes, still omitting the highlighted notes in the right, and played through to the third phrase, still with the simplified version. Once I was confident with this, I worked on the third phrase to add back the missing left-hand notes and practiced through to the end of the fourth phrase. Then I joined the first, second, third and fourth phrases together. Just this alone might take a few days depending on how long you have to practice this piece each day. I've probably said this in most of my tutorials, but I think it's really important to resist the temptation to move forward too quickly. Our simplified versions give us nice firm foundations. It would be a shame to ruin these foundations by simply throwing the remaining notes back at them. Follow the same idea with the 5th, 6th phrases, add back the remaining notes with just the 5th, the 1st, and then the remaining notes of the 6th. We should now be in a position where we can practice this entire segment with almost all of our missing notes, just those right-hand highlight notes missing. This then for this segment is our final step. Work on each individual phrase with a highlight note and then join that phrase to the following one. Going back to our second segment, we can now simply start adding back the left-hand notes. However, what I found helpful was that first add back in our first measure of this segment, keep the second measure simplified, and add back in the third measure. Only once this feels good should we add back those second measure back. For the remaining phrase, it's simply a case of removing those imaginary fermatas. We can either do this one by one or gradually reducing the length of the fermata in each set of notes. In practice, I tended to find that I was sort of doing both somewhat intuitively as my confidence with the piece grew. Again, each day play through the entire section as a whole, retaining any simplified versions until you've done the detailed work of adding back the missing notes. As you can see, I'm trying to increase the difficulty only very slightly each time by adding back notes progressively and quite likely over a number of days. Our final section is perhaps the most difficult of all to play, although in some ways it was a close call with the second for me. Here both hands start moving around the keyboard quite extensively, whilst in the third section those little right hand highlight notes were relatively close to the main melody. Now they are often an octave or more above, and so we're obliged to jump to them, whilst at the same time having a left hand obliged to make some fairly large jumps. Again, we can start by just playing through the melody. It's very similar to that in the first and second sections. However, as you would expect with Rachmaninoff, there are some little differences. We can split this into segments using a similar division to that which we used for the first section. To practice it, we'll use a very similar strategy to that which we used for the third section. We'll omit left-hand notes, but we'll do so using a slightly different pattern. If we look at the first phrase, what we can do in the left hand is to play the bass note, omit the next two triplets, then play the following set of triplets with the first of the next set and omit the last two. To me, this made far more musical and ergonomic sense. Indeed, if we look closely at the score, the notes we're going to play are those where Rachmaninoff uses a hairpin to bring them out above the others. For the right hand, we can omit the highlight notes, thus this hand doesn't need to jump about at all for now. The same approach could be taken with the remaining phrases in this segment. The following segment leads itself equally well to this simplification as I've marked out here for you. For our final segment, I actually found it was less helpful to try to simplify the left hand, as here the key is not about moving around the keyboard, but I think more about fingering. Thus, keeping all of the notes together is more helpful. However, we can continue for now to omit those highlight notes in the right hand. I would learn each segment in this simplified manner first, perhaps even to the point where we can play the first and second segments and the second and third segments when we practice. Once we're feeling good with this, then let's go back to the first segment and start adding back the notes we omitted. Depending on how difficult you find this, you might want to do it in 3 steps. So, looking at the first phrase again, let's first add back just the downward part of the arpeggio at the end of each measure, and still omit the second 2 triplets. So do this phrase by phrase as we did in the other sections. We can continue to practice the entire segment, however build the phrases progressively over a number of days if necessary. We can follow the same exact process with the second segment. Next, let's add back the highlight notes in the right hand, while still omitting the initial triplets of each measure in the left. Again, start working phrase by phrase, and again, depending on how tricky you find this, you might wish to work on only a single phrase in a day. We can also work on adding back the right hand notes in the final segment. Our final step, of course, is now to add back those final left-hand notes in the first and second segments. So with these tips, you should now have everything you need to practice this fabulous prelude. All that remains is to start stitching things together properly. There's a fine line between simply playing things through and practicing them. I would be inclined to get used to playing 2 sections at a time, so first and second, second and third, third and fourth initially. This is because there is an awful lot going on in this piece and lots to think about. Thus it's important we don't overwhelm ourselves with it initially. Later, we can work on playing sections 1, 2 and 3 together and sections 2, 3 and 4 together. You'll see this idea in many of my tutorials as I developed a 4-step process to help me learn things. Now, before you even sit down at the piano and start on this, I'd recommend you really spend some time to discover it properly. There are a good variety of performance videos as well as other tutorials which focus on different aspects of the piece. There's an awful lot we can learn from multiple tutorials, even though some will of course contain conflicting advice. One of my favourite performances is of Grigory Sokolov, where interestingly we can see his hands pretty much all the way through. This can give some interesting tips on fingering. For example, the way he rolls the F sharp minor chord in the final section is to land on the top note with his thumb, something I would never have thought of doing. However, this has 2 amazing advantages. First, given it's a loud dynamic, the thumb easily has the weight to really bring it out. Secondly, of course, we don't need to jump to the F sharp above it, as we can comfortably reach it. This, of course, is only one example, and as you watch more videos, you'll get more and more ideas. Equally, you might notice a big variation in tempi between performers. Sokolov plays it quite slowly, Richter around 25% faster. Both are at the genius level, and so I don't think either could be said to be right or wrong. Now I've gone through this piece from beginning to end for you, as that makes logical sense in a tutorial like this. However, it's not necessarily the order in which I would practice it. And I've linked a video here for you that actually uses this same piece to demonstrate an idea I've called interleaving or spaced repetition when we practice. So you might find that a useful additional resource to create your own practice plan for this marvellous piece of music. If you're not already, then please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to click that little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I thank you very much for watching today and look forward to seeing you very soon.